Pandemics mark the history of St. Joseph Hospital. Opened just a decade when the 1918 flu hit. This year, it braced for COVID. COVID never overwhelmed St. Joe's, but the costs are $50 million and counting.
That's just a recipe for disaster for any hospital, not just ours.
Nationwide, hospitals and health system losses could top a staggering $202 billion from March to June.
Not since the Great Depression have doctors and hospitals and other healthcare institutions faced the kinds of disruption that they're experiencing right now.
As the virus raced up the East Coast, St. Joe's tripled its beds, scrambled for ventilators and PPE, and stopped elective surgeries, cutting off the major profit stream most hospitals depend on.
It does represent 72% of your revenue now is diminished.
That's a body blow.
That is a body blow, because we have to be safe.
So we're going to talk to your son today.
Across the country, telehealth visits are up, but other hospital services plummeting. Dermatology down 67%, gynecology 75%, ophthalmology 81%. To cut costs, more than 250 hospitals furloughed thousands of workers, including Caitlin Sassville at St. Joe's.
I was actually kind of shocked. I've been working crazy hours at first. I was upset. I cried. Operating room, it's Katie.
Now with elective surgeries to schedule, Sassville is back after 2 weeks at home, one of 6 workers recalled out of 300. Hospital's other financial hit?
We're having to spend 10 and 20 times more for the same piece of PPE.
Burning through 1,100 isolation gowns a day.
They have a pattern.
St. Joe's supply chain manager Robin Gershik is ironing together homemade gowns on her dining room table.
I can't make respirators. I can't make N95 masks. But this gown is so simple. Why can't we do that?
But it may not be enough to keep hospitals alive.
They'll cut back their services. They may no longer provide hospital or maternity care. They may just have become an emergency department or an urgent care center and a smaller hospital sector when the dust settles.
Making hospitals the next victims of the virus.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.